And if everyone would take a seat, we'll get started in just a moment. Let me just say a word about Mark, if we can reel him in. Come on, Mark. Mark Anschutz's father and grandfather were both priests, and his daughter's a priest, so it's a long lineage of clergy. Mark ran Christ Church in Alexandria, in Old Town, when it had about 430 parishioners, and when he left, it had 3,300, a remarkable growth in the parish. He went up to become rector of St. James's Church on Madison Avenue in New York City, where in 2 years they doubled their annual giving. Then Mark was called down to St. Michael and All Angels in Dallas, Texas, which was our largest Episcopal church at the time, and during his tenure, it stayed as our largest Episcopal church. And they launched a wonderful project where they literally dedicated huge amounts of resources to partnering with a 65-block area of Dallas and helped to transform that with programs for students after school, tutoring programs, job training programs, and I think it's one of the most remarkable Episcopal ministries in our country. So please join me as we welcome Mark Anschutz here to St. Thomas Church for our forum today.
Closer to you are Episcopalians, you people. I was commenting to somebody, you know why Episcopalians don't sit in the back of the church while you at St. Thomas attend at 8 o'clock, particularly in the back of the church? The reason is that you'd feel uncomfortable sitting out there on the tarmac and the roadway. I want to pray now seriously for you, with you. This is a prayer that guided all of my parishes. It was written by Sir Francis Drake, and with his missions and his loyalties and life in mind, but it really does apply to who we are. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Disturb us, Lord, when we are too well pleased with ourselves, when our dreams have come true because we have dreamed too little, when we arrive safely because we've sailed too close to the shore. Disturb us, Lord, when with the abundance of the things we possess, we have lost our thirst for the waters of life. Having fallen in love with life, we have ceased to dream of eternity. And in our efforts to build a new earth, we have allowed our vision of the new heaven to dim. Disturb us, Lord, to dare more boldly, to venture on wider seas where storms will show your mastery. Where losing sight of land, we shall find the stars. We ask you to push back the horizons of our hopes and to push us into the future in strength, courage, hope, and love. And this we ask in the name of our captain, who is Jesus Christ. Amen. All right. I'm here to talk to you about money and possessions. And I venture to say that there are some empty tables here because they knew that was the subject. In humankind, in terms of your anatomy, often The most sensitive nerve in the human body runs between the mind and the wallet. And I am going to touch that nerve for a few moments this afternoon and receive questions. But I'm going to touch it gently, and I'm going to touch it, I hope, in the way that meets God's approval. Now, before I begin, I do want to thank again your rector in this parish. I suspect that you have no idea the impact that you have had upon the greater Episcopal Church, which I so love and seek even now at 73 to serve with every bit of energy I have. I simply repeat that. Thank you, thank you, thank you, and keep it up. Keep it up. Just before I begin, though, would you share with me, not all of you, but whoever cares to, you heard about this dealing with the challenge of possessions and wealth. What kind of expectations did you bring to this gathering? What would you like to see occur in our brief time together? How would you be edified? And there are no wrong answers, okay? There are no wrong answers. You've got opinions back at this table, I know that, so if you want to offer one, please do. But what are your expectations? I'm picking on you. That I'll explain all of the manifestations of that gospel? I can't, no. Go ahead. Well, that as Merrick and I were walking, that was our prayer right at the door before we walked in here. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to do my best. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
I want to learn how the Episcopal Church is thinking about money and wealth.
Oh.
It's different than those prosperity evangelicals who spend and seems like a racket. Really different.
In some instances, it is a racket. It is not scriptural, and it is not ultimately satisfying. And I'll tell you, I'll talk to you about how Episcopalians regard this, and it'll make you feel better about being an Episcopalian, I guarantee you. Of course, I work for the corporation, so you're bound to get that. Anyone else? Expectations? Merrick. Yes, and then I'll come to you, Frank. Yes, Frank. No, I'm going to go, I'm not doing age, I'm doing good looks. Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think we're hoping that this is a season for all of us. We're thinking about giving, the season of planning, season of drive, and approaches. You're here with this topic today is not accidental. I came to get guidance. Think about it this time of year and try to plan what I'm going to do next year for the church, and that has to fit with everything else.
Yeah, don't let me out of here. Okay, I got you. But don't let me out of here without talking about legacy giving, what you do at the end of your life, and how that fits into being not necessarily Episcopalian, but a Christian, and how you regard wealth. Merrick, what were you going to say? Okay. Yeah, I should get, as I said in the leadership yesterday, my fundamental source of income in this life, Social Security and the church pension fund. But I should get a check every month from the Chamber of Commerce in Texas, because I I love the place, and and people suffer such misconceptions about Texas, and I'm, as an old East Coaster, anyway, I can really get going on Texas. What I'm not going to talk to you about is fundraising. It really bugs me. I'm going to damn it, if you will, in the course of what I'm going to say to you. I'll come to that. The problem historically in our church around the whole idea of fundraising. What I am going to talk to you about is your posture, your lifestyle as it relates to giving. But backing up for just a moment, I love this. I want to share it with you. We're moving in on the Christmas season. It's Fred, right? Yeah. And apart from the Nativity, what is your favorite Christmas story? Oh, come on. There's no wrong. You're all right. Gifts to the Magi? That's yours? I bet if I said Dickens' A Christmas Carol, that would be number one on your list. Yeah, it's way up on mine. I'll take the Nativity, but anyway, second is that. I was checking this out, and notice the Dickens' description of Scrooge from the first. And I quote, "Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, old Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained, and solitary as an oyster." But this is what people miss, I think. Many pages later, that's really on the first page, but many pages later, after the visit of the three ghosts, Scrooge is a changed man, to say the least. And he remembers as he awakes the goose in the market. And he says to himself, and I quote, "I'll send it to Bob Cratchit," he whispered, rubbing his hands and splitting with a laugh. And he sends the boy off, as you recall, and he comes back with the goose. He says of Bob Cratchit, "He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim." Now, because, this is the subtlety, because the goose is so large, the young boy can't haul it over there. And so Scrooge, in his emerging generosity, says, "You must have a cab." Then Dickens writes these lines, and they are lines I think a lot of people miss, but I love them. "You must have a cab." And the chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair again and chuckled till he cried, and chuckled again. Now you ask what I'm up to, what the church, our church, means. It is to help me and you in that kind of transformation. I'm not accusing you of being, clutching, covetous, or scraping, but it is a problem for us all, is it not? And I guess that some of you are drawn here because you recognize that tension. And the church's job is to liberate us from the weight of that kind of thing. And at the center of our liberation is dealing, as it always has been, with fear. The fear of not simply having enough, living a life of scarcity, rather a life of abundance. Now, and I want, as you leave, I hope there's a little bit of transformation in maybe one or two of you, or hopefully all of you. What do I mean by that? In our prayer book, when we baptize, we say, "Help this person, this child, this adult, grow into the full stature of Christ." C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, said it was poses the question, what is the function of the church? Is it to build buildings, create hospitals, educational institutions? And he says, no, it's none of that. It is to make little Christs. My function here today, in my preaching, whatever I'm doing, is to help you grow up into the full stature of Jesus Christ. And by the way, I help myself in that. And it's a mighty demand, but it is an extraordinarily rewarding thing to see ourselves as growing more into the full stature of Jesus Christ, growing in our capacity for generosity and kindness, to be a better friend, a better listener, more courageous to stand up against all the blight of this world, all the poverty, all the corruption, to grow up into the full stature of Christ. I would argue that money and possessions gets in the way of that growth. It is why Jesus Christ talks, in fact, so much about money. Now, let's go to the history of giving in the Episcopal Church, all right? You'll like this. This is I'm putting on a platter. Right, here we go. How was the church supported primarily prior to the American Revolution? Through the crown, George III, Bishop of London, monies to build churches, educate clergy, get them here, take care of basic expenses. If you put money in the plate, it generally went to help the poor, and in Virginia it helped the poor and build highways, okay? But basically, it was a dole system. And it's why, I guess, General Howe felt it was all right to come and take all this property. He said, well, it's George's anyway, he's paying for it, so you know what I'm talking about. Did not General Howe come here and onto these properties and look up? He must have felt quite uncomfortable. He said, how versed are you in the history of this parish? Do you know what I'm talking about? Okay, good. I worked on that. I wanted you to be, to have it. Okay. Now, in the course of the Revolution, a hard time, half the clergy in our church went to Canada. All kinds of people left our church, and it was hard times. The church was sustained really for about a 10, 12-year period by the very wealthy, by people like George and Martha Washington, who were tithers, and Francis Scott Key, who was in my dad's parish in Georgetown, a founding member of that parish, gave enormous amounts of money to sustain the church through that critical era. And then at the end of that, in the early part of the 18th century, how was the church sustained? For 120 years plus. Pew rentals. You go into old churches and you see either you see the holes on the end of the pews, or you see the brass plaques or the numbers. Pew rentals. And in my parish in Alexandria, they were all numbered, and this is how it worked. This is how stewardship was run in our church. The more you paid, the closer you were to the front. And there was a sequence back to the middle of the church. In the middle of the church, there was an open pew for visitors. Anybody behind that was a non-pledger, a non-giver. They didn't buy a pew. The galleries were created in most southern churches for our African-American brothers and sisters. But that's a bad system, obviously. But that's what generated most of the energy. Then you come to 1920, fascinating year. There was a thing in PBS this week about the year 1920. That was the year in terms of our population that more people lived in urban sprawl than on the farm. 1920. And at the 1920 General Convention of the Episcopal Church, there was an awakening. There was also a very deliberate consciousness about the brokenness found in the society and the need of the church to respond. And so this is where the pledge was born, at that convention. We will ask each individual, not a few rich people to foot the bill, not taxing people for their pew and one thing or another, but we will ask everyone to discern what their giving will be and offer a pledge upon which we can plan and do our work and go forward together. And so the pledge was introduced, and it took another 25 years for that crossover to occur, for churches to release from the pew rental to pledging. Now, the problem with that period as it emerged, and I fault clergy with this, is that the whole idea of the pledge became, for lack of a better term, I had a parish on Madison Avenue. It got Madison Avenued. People took over and they began to use devices to raise money. Pie charts, thermometers. Guilt was not unheard of. Jesus never used guilt, but some lay leaders and some clergy perfectly happy to use guilt. And that system got all twisted, and it wasn't functioning very well. And then there was this occurrence, which is, again, it's like the Scrooge. I think a lot of people who know the history of our church miss this. In the late 1960s, the Bishop of Alabama, of all places, Alabama, got fed up with all of this. The guilt, the thermometers, the Madison Avenue, and he took a group of clergy and off to the Camp and Conference Center in northwest Alabama, and they were there a week. And he said, what are we going to do with this? And it was like the Transfiguration. They came down from that mountain area with one conclusion, and this is where I'm going with you this morning. One single conclusion. If people are acquainted with what the Old Testament and the New Testament have to say about money and possessions, if people are brought to an understanding of the mind of Jesus Christ in terms of possessions and money, everything will be all right. Everything will be all right. Now, this is a period where membership in the Episcopal Church, as a result of really our engagement in the racial issue, there was a lot of turmoil in our church. A lot of people left. So numbers began to go down dramatically. But with the Alabama plan, as people engaged it, giving went up dramatically in this same church. It's really miraculous. To the point that when you ask people prior to that where the Episcopal Church ranked in terms of giving, we were down here. The Presbyterians, the Methodists, the Lutherans, the Church of the Nazarene, we were down here. We jumped in a period of 10 years from the bottom to second place. And we're still there. Who's in first place? The Baptists. Okay, the Baptists. All right, we'll get them. Anyway, that's the Alabama plan. And all successful stewardship emanates from that simple criteria. Now, what I want to do is asking a lot of both of us. Let's take a quick look at what, in fact, does the Old Testament have to say, in summary, as if there were and there is a thread of several truths, like a rich tapestry that moves through the Old Testament. What do we know about what the Old Testament is teaching us? One is this, and this is really hard, particularly anybody go to Harvard Business School, because you have been punished in entirely another mentality. It is this. The Old Testament says that we don't own anything. Get it straight. It's not ours. It's all a gift from God, whatever we have. That's where it comes from. We're set down on this earth for a period of time to be stewards of what it is that God has entrusted to us. That's what the Old Testament says. We don't have anything. It's all what God has given to us. And when you start living that way, it is really quite remarkable and liberating. Secondly, we are called upon to take what it is that God has entrusted to us and return a thoughtful measure of that to God's purposes, to show forth, in effect, the same generosity that God has given to us, we are giving back. Thank you. Remember Jackie Gleason? And then finally, and this is still true of the Jewish community, we're under the law, the letter of the law. You got to do it. If you don't do it, you're going to be punished. You're going to be cast out of the community. You're going to be segregated from the community. You must do it. So there are those three principles. Now, I'm not an Old Testament scholar. Let me just tell you a story. When my Marietta went to the Yale Divinity School, she went to the opening reception, And one of my professors, while I was there, a fellow named Lansing Hicks, spotted her name tag. Now, Lansing had lost all of his glands here, and so he had to talk. He's always had a glass of water, and he had to talk like this because he was always creating moisture in his throat. So he talked like that. So he sees Marietta, and he's a really good guy. He goes up to Mary and says, Miss Anschutz, by chance, is your father and Marietta, who's not always on her best behavior, but on this occasion, first time. Well, and Lansing said, well, Miss Anschutz, I certainly hope you're going to be a better Old Testament scholar than your father. And she was. I don't claim to understand all of the Old Testament, but I know, and it begins, Genesis goes all the way through these three threads. Now, more importantly, what has the New Testament to say to us? And what it doesn't say is that money in any way is important. It doesn't place any value. Was that your, yeah, doesn't place any value on that. That's why what those guys are proclaiming is heretical for a Christian, because it's not there. Jesus doesn't go there at all. And then it says, it doesn't say that we're any longer under the old law. There's no talk of that. Jesus doesn't do that. You must. And it doesn't, interestingly enough, the New Testament says very little about that often dreaded word. And you want to get vestries uptight and stewardship, the tithe. Oh my gosh, that word just, truth of the matter is, the reaction is the result of ignorance. The tithe is really valuable, and I'm happy to talk to you about it. But Jesus' assumption was that everybody did tithe. I mean, that was just the way it was. So he didn't have to talk about it. The only thing he says about the tithe is critical, actually. Don't boast on your tithing, he says. But he doesn't say much more about it. It's not until the New Testament, to the epistles and the early church, that the tithe really comes into place. But what is said in the New Testament is that the same things as the Old Testament. Everything we have is a gift from God, from a gracious, good, and loving God. It's entrusted to us, and I like to see my life this way. God has given me so much. I live off a fixed income, but by God, I live in America. I'm a philanthropist. I take real joy in sacrificing and giving back. God has given it to me, and while I'm on this earth, living this short journey, which has now reached from 1 to 73 years, it's my privilege, it's a point of excitement to take that gift that God has given to me and treat it the way God wants me to treat it. And it so uplifts my life and makes life so much more meaningful. This is hard stuff because the world doesn't teach you this at all. But the world is simply wrong. So what else does the New Testament have to say? It says that we are, in fact, no longer under that law. We are free. We are free through Jesus Christ. Fred, how do you know that you love him? How do you know that you love him? Married people. How do you know ultimately? Well, I would argue this. You know you are loved when ultimately you are free. You are not dominated. You are not used. You are not somebody's possession. But you are living in a relationship with somebody who cares about who you are and who you are becoming, and they give you the freedom to grow up into that. You are there to help them, but not to dominate, not to use. You are free. And that's the way God deals with all of us. Ours is a God who frees us to run our own lives. We are not led around by the nose. Predestination is lousy theology. We are free. You can't love anything that you don't free. God loves us. God frees us. And that's critical to stewardship and understanding what the New Testament has to say. Also, and you've heard a little bit of this morning. I could go on about grace. I didn't really intend for the sermon to, anyway, but the grace thing occurred to me in terms of the sermon. But what the New Testament reveals is grace. God has done all of this. Hard to take sometimes, freely. Just because God loves us, God has bestowed all of this upon us. And what the New Testament implies is that we are called upon to be God-like, to return in the same way some of what God has given to us, that we may find life and meaning in all that we have, money and possessions. But the most critical thing in the New Testament, and it is why Jesus talks more about money, and I'm ready to defend this. I might not be a great Old Testament scholar, but I'm working on that New Testament. I argue that Jesus talks more about money than anything else. I'm going to touch on that. Why? Because my Christology, that's a theological word. How do you view Christ? My Christology is very much about God choosing to send his Son into the world to, one, teach us every aspect of what it means to love. That boundless word, to get it all. Neighbor, spouse, child, enemy, that child halfway around the world who dies at the rate of 1 every 30 seconds, to love that child. And secondly, God sent his Son into the world, and Christ died about this, to remind each of us to put God in the center of our lives, to displace all these other things. And you know them. In America, the God can very easily be the job. We are a unique culture. You can talk about the Japanese all day long. But for us, we take so much of our sense of self-worth out of the job. You know, I find myself in groups, well, what do you do? I shouldn't even be asking that question because it kind of feeds that thing. The most important thing is my job, how successful I am. It isn't even what we are remunerated. It's how we feel about that work. We define ourselves around it. And then there is money. That is such a powerful sense of self-definition, and it can so easily be the center of our lives. And the list goes on. Booze, drugs, social cachet, and the most common of all, ourselves. Old number one, more important than God. He comes in the world, and the New Testament declares this and pleads with us that life may have order. Put God in the center. And so often, the first step has to do with money, has to do with possessions. Now, how are we with time? Because don't worry about me, okay? Worry about yourselves. Are we all right with time here, Merrick, for a little bit? Okay? All right, then I'm going to whip it. Look at the story closely. This is Mark's argument about the New Testament and money. The widow's mite. No name on her, one of the great women of the New Testament. And I loved it. I had a bishop in New York, Dick Grine, and we were sitting there once in his office. He had his feet up on a desk. I got along with him very well. I had my feet up on a desk with the bishop. We were just shooting the breeze. And we were just talking about the widow. And he says, you know, the temple didn't need the widow's mite, but it needed the widow mightily. Isn't that a good line? There are people in this church who don't have much but give much, not only in their offerings, but in their life in one thing or another. And you need to be like the widow in your way, witnessing in that way. And then there's the greatest short story of all time. Eat your heart out, O. Henry, Shakespeare. But there is no story to compare to the prodigal. And you talk about something that's like what did I say this morning, an octopus with all sorts of opportunities of different themes. But that boy, why did he take his money and go? Because he thought life ought to be invested in money and things. I'm going to go off to, take whatever my father would give me, go to the University of Virginia, and that's what life's all about, just raising a roof and carrying on. And then there's that great line. He came to his senses. He saw money for what it was. And then there is that incredible moment. The father frees him. Do you notice that? The father lets him go. He doesn't believe, oh, please stay. He has to give him that freedom to grow up, to emerge from adolescence into adulthood. But the father's always aching. The father's always watching. And then he spots the boy a long way off. Now, this is an old Jewish guy. This is what they do. What a story. But it starts in money. The Samaritan the same way. You got robbers, people forget the robbers. But then you've got the Samaritan, the others just walk by, they're observing the religious law, they hustle along. But that Samaritan pulls out his American Express, throws it down, take care of all the bills, lives this kind of absurd, overflowing kind of generosity, and that's the point of the tale. And the talents, well, anyway, I could just do this all day. But let me, gotta tell you about Zacchaeus. This is my grandfather's favorite story. So Zacchaeus is up in the thing, and up in a tree, and everybody resents him. Why? Because of how he handled money. He cheated them, and he was a little guy and one thing or another, and he was alone because of money. He was ostracized because of money. And Jesus comes along and looking out of the corner of his eye up in the tree, remember the sermon, up in the corner of the eye? Come down from that tree. I'm coming to your house. Boy, I would love to have gone to that dinner party. I would love to have heard what Jesus had to say to him in that moment, because he came out a changed man. He'd thrown off that money. Not only had he thrown it off, I'm going to give it all back, twofold. And I'm sorry for what I did. But money no longer is going to rule my being. Now, here's a question. Then there is the sad stories. Judas. Now, Judas's motive was not entirely money, and that's wrong. There were other things. There's a lot of theories about why Judas acted as he did, but money was a part of the betrayal. It played a part. Have you ever seen Jesus Christ Superstar? Yeah. I saw a production that ended, and the way they ended it was that Judas came out, and he's in the dim dark. And Jesus comes out of the other end of the stage, and the lights come up, and Jesus approaches him and embraces him. I have no doubt that Jesus forgave Judas and restored him. We can discuss the theology of that at some other point, but that's my view. Judas is not the saddest character. Who's the saddest character? The rich young man. The only person in the New Testament Jesus asked to follow him who chose not to, and why? Because of money. Because of money. All right. I'm going to wind this up, but not in an easy way. I'm going to touch that nerve. And I'm going to do it gladly. I'm going to do it for your sake. When I was growing up, until the day I married Peggy, my closest friend was my father, the priest. He was imperfect, but he was wonderful. And I used to go to him with all the issues of my life, all kinds of things. Should I join this fraternity? What about this brokenheartedness that I felt over this high school sweetheart? Should I run for class president? I mean, there were all of these things and these decisions to be made and corrections in my life. And he was very sage and I must say shrewd in his responses. But he would always end in this way. Now, Mark, that's what I think. But Mark, what I want you to do is take this to your secret place. And you and God work out what you're going to do. You see, he assumed from the earliest age that I had a secret place, a place that I went to engage God. And to this day, I have several secret places. And I urge you to consider it. Where is it? That beautiful little chapel off the side in the main sanctuary? I don't know. Is it out here on a bench? I don't know. Is it a corner of your? I don't know. But find your secret place. And this is my charge to you. Go to that secret place alone and weigh in your own mind, honestly and before God, where you stand in terms of money and possessions, in terms of the support that you render for this parish church, which is money well spent. Not always in the church, but here it is well spent. And the things you do other than that. Go to that secret place. Take some papers with you, maybe, and consider the biblical tithe. Take a little computer and your tax return and figure out just where you are. Are you at 1, 2, 3, 10, 20? Parishioners of mine, in Virginia actually, 50 and 60% of their gross income tithed. The tithe is not 10%. The tithe is struggling. The tithe is knowing what it is actually that I have returned to God. It is not living in fear. It is not living in ignorance. It's knowing just where I stand. And it is liberating. Go to that secret place. And maybe bring along your pledge card, okay? Now, you're going to get some good cards from the Red Cross. They're great. For me, I just love the Salvation Army. They seem, every place I go where there's a critical crisis, there they are. Those wonderful, wonderful people. And I support them through my tithe, okay? But your pledge card to this parish, I would argue, is a different ball game. It represents a time in the year when you stop cold flat and you analyze your giving. 70% of Americans only give out of habit. Out of habit. Only 3% do what I'm suggesting. Sit down, run the numbers, figure out where they stand, try and improve on where they are in building God's kingdom. That card, when you bring it back here, see it differently, okay? Put it in the envelope, fill it out, whatever it is, and set it ideally. I mean, if I were running this operation, I'd have you out of your pews, bringing it up, and putting it on the altar. It's a different deal, that card. It is a covenant with God. It's an agreement with God that you have reached after some struggle and some consequence in your life. It's not to say the other cards aren't important, but they're not nearly as important as that card because it represents your relationship to God. I'm not running out of steam. I'm just saying to myself, you better be quiet here, Mark. You lay a lot on these poor souls. I want to end this one. I was talking to leadership yesterday, and you've got some great leadership. You really do. I'm an intuitive. I mean, I picked this up. I can tell when. Anyway, I won't go there. But your leadership is not only delightful and gracious, they're earnest. I said this to them, and I say it to you, and it comes from the deepest place in my life and in my living. What I have asked of you, what I've tried to express to you, the kind of change that I would like to see in your life and increasingly in my own. I'm not there yet. It's not going to happen without God. When you go to your secret place, the first utterance is, God, help me to do this. You are inadequate to it. To anything of any great consequence in your life, you are inadequate to it. To illness, to divorce, to job loss, to raising children, boy, that is filled with inadequacy. But with God, it is possible. Go to God and render that prayer. God, help me to deal with this honestly, to deal with it thoughtfully, to deal with integrity, and to deal with it with your mind, not the world's mind, not fundraising, but your mind. And I assure you that remarkable things will happen in your lives. I assure you of that. I've been a priest 48 years. I got too much proof of what I'm talking about in the lives of wonderful people. So with that in mind, the Lord be. All right, take the rest of the day off.